Christmas, everybody. Merry Christmas to you, Kim and John, Jenny and Anna, and not to forget little Schwartzy, Laddie's old buddy. You had requested, Kim, that I make some tapes and give you the whole story in the background of my service in the Marine Corps. So, in starting this huge epistle, it would be good to remember that the story gets started on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It's becoming more and more evident that it evidently wasn't such a surprise to the President and his cabinet as we thought it was, through the facts that are coming out through the Freedom of Information Act, but that's a completely different story. So life in Minneapolis after December 7th, 1941, which happened to be on a Sunday, I had been home from church and the family had finished having dinner, and Grandma was doing the dishes, and Raleigh and I were in the living room listening to the great big floor model radio, and some programs were on. I think it had a special with a Benny Goodman or an Artie Shaw show had been on the radio, and we had been listening to that when all of a sudden there was a break-in, which was very, very unusual for any news broadcast or any program to be broken into. And it was announced that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And the media thought everybody is, where's Pearl Harbor? At that time, we knew that about the only thing we knew was that there were some little islands someplace out in the Pacific. And it was a case where very few people were traveling like they do today. There was one Pan American flight a week and a cruise ship or so that would go out there now and then, but nothing big or anywhere near the extent that it is today. So everyone was just shocked, and they were putting on various people to explain what Pearl Harbor was to us, which was the largest fleet headquarters that we had in the Pacific, and that they were starting to get reports through about certain casualties, and some of the particulars were starting to unfold of really what had happened out there. But it was about an hour or so later, and there were little kids out on the street selling extras. And those were papers that were put out. Special editions were run, and the headline said, Japs bomb Pearl Harbor. And so everybody was in a state of confusion. Everybody was running outdoors and talking to their neighbors, and the telephone was ringing. And the calm and the peace and the life that we had known it as had ended as of that attack. I was scheduled to go out to play in a band. I was in a little band that was playing out at a place called the Bungalow, and I went out there, and everybody was of course madder than heck at the Japanese, and there was a lot of emotion, and everybody was unable to handle the situation. They just couldn't put it into perspective. Our life up to that time had been mostly dealt with going to school and working and nobody was even thinking in terms, that the Americans would ever be bombed on their own soil. Which, of course, at that time was Pearl Harbor was a definite part of the United States, in as much as we had such a huge base there. But just as everybody can remember where they were and what they were doing when President John Kennedy was shot, people of my era very vividly remember where they were and what they were doing when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So immediately, our quiet life had very definitely ended. At that time, of course, there was no television or videotapes or anything of that kind. All we had was radios, and there was a radio in the kitchen and a big radio in the living room. We didn't have radios in our bedrooms, my brother and I, because they would distract from our homework, so we weren't allowed to have radios up there. But up to that time, we didn't have news broadcasts on the hour, every hour, or anything. Our main source of news would be our local announcer, who was a famous old Cedric Adams, and no one went to bed in Minnesota, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota until they'd heard the 10 o'clock news from Cedric Adams. And then everybody would hit the sack. But we would have, via radio, we would have different things like train accidents or airplane accidents and things that be announced. And there was some news, of course, that we always got from Washington, but it had mostly to do with the with the budgets and with the normal, just dry news out of Washington. There wasn't anything at all like it is today with news on the hour, every hour. But shortly after Pearl Harbor, that all changed, and people just had a complete thirst for finding out what was going on and what was happening, so that everything changed, and we went into a morning news program and a noon news program, and along with our good old 10 o'clock news, which kept us up to date. There's so many thousands of things that happen so fast, locally and nationally, that it's all hard to put it into perspective. But I see, it's just like in some of the old movies that you probably have seen. Immediately on Monday, after the president had given his very address, President Roosevelt brought in Congress, and he made his very famous speech reiterating to us that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor, and that as far as they knew now, there were between 2,000 and 3,000 casualties. And some of the stories were coming out now of individual heroism and how the Arizona had gone down with all men aboard. Very, very few survivors there. And there'd be people describing to us on radio, and of course the papers came with us the next day and the following weeks. We were given an exact location of where Pearl Harbor was, although it was not a state as it is now. It was territory, but we did have, and it was our largest naval base in the Pacific, many, many times larger than our installation out at the Navy head in the Philippines. But everybody had to do a lot of boning up on their geography and to get the lowdown on it. And locally, we didn't have any. We had very few people in the city that weren't white. On the West Coast, immediate stories were coming out how the Japanese Americans out there, or I should say American Japanese, who were as American as we are, were were being having rocks thrown at them and insults thrown at them, and it was just a complete change, just overnight. Gardeners were fired from their jobs, and eventually all these people ended up in internment camps, as you've probably seen on television. And it was probably a very good thing. It was probably as much for their protection, but it didn't take Congress long to round them all up. They had the National Guard and the Army rounding up all these Japanese people, these American Japanese, and like I say, they all lost their jobs. They couldn't take anything with them other than what they could carry, and they lost their homes and their gardens and everything they had, their cars, everything. But looking back at it now, yes, it was the hysteria and the bigotry that we had here, but as I say, it could have been just as much for their own protection, because the civilian population was absolutely just wild on anybody that didn't look American, and by that, you know, being white, being the old WASP profile. And a lot of injustice was done there. And like I say, about this time they were cranking up the war bond drives, and songs were being written about all aspects of the service, and different papers were full of how the companies were switching over to very heavy armament work. You have to remember at that time that we were supplying on the Lend-Lease program. Churchill and Roosevelt were working very, very close together, and Churchill was hounding us for more and more and more supplies, so that we did have quite a bit of industry that was producing jeeps and trucks and tanks and uniforms and ammunition and making guns. And a lot of this was going over on those infamous Murmansk runs to Russia, and where we had to hold we had whole fleets of tankers and ships and freighters and these huge convoys, and they wouldn't be protected more than about half the way, and then the rest of the time they really got it from the German Air Force. And but we couldn't do enough to help England and to help Russia. And we had a huge amount of people. There were millions of people in this country that did not believe in war and did not want to get us involved in it. And Colonel Lindbergh had come back from a trip to Germany and had really explained in detail how strong they were and how much of an air force they had and everything. So this was interpreted as being that Lindbergh was more of a pacifist, and that he was shunned by everybody immediately because he didn't have the gung-ho spirit. So that when Pearl Harbor came along, we weren't exactly a nation that wasn't producing war material, because as I allude to, we were doing everything we could with planes and ships and all types of tanks that we would be sending over to help England in their war. Churchill was very upset. It's quite well known now that he knew quite a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, but he wanted to get every ship and everything he could from America to go to his side. And we had just, I think it was 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor, as history has shown, we had taken out 4 or 5 great big men-of-war ships through the canal from Pearl and sent them over to into the Atlantic. So we had a real strong anti-war feeling in this country. And so when Pearl Harbor was attacked, it gave Roosevelt the excuse to really go all out now on 100% war footing. So right away, the restrictions were put in effect. There were coupons for gas. You'd have the initials. They used the letters of A, B, C, and D to signify what class of gasoline priority you could get. And of course, with all of this came the saving all the old rubber tires and have those picked up for the war effort, and tin cans. And so a little insight on that was that Dayton's ran a big sale that they were having, their white sale, and that they were letting you know that this might be the last time for a long time that you could get sheets. Grandma went down, she must have bought 25 or 30 sheets. That'd be enough to last our family for a long, long time. But it was typical of how people were reacting to this whole new change of life. But anyway, back on going into the services. Mother, of course, was crying, and Dad was very upset, knowing that they had two boys, 18, and Raleigh, I believe, was about 23. And they're realizing that we are just at the ripe age to be going into the services. And it was made very clear that Raleigh, being the oldest, he would definitely be the first one to go, and that neither one of us should be in any big hurry to enter the service. There was going to be plenty of time, as far as the folks were concerned, for us to go off into the service. And of course, my attitude was I wanted to jump and go right now, and had gone around to the Army and the Navy and the Air Corps and into the Navy aviation program, recruiting offices, trying to get information. And about this time, of course, all us kids were down on the corner talking and trying to figure out. We'd get together at night, and out at the nightclubs where I was working, there'd be people at the bar, and everybody was talking war, 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 and someone was going to join this group, and someone was going to join that group. And there was a friend of mine called Franny Bathan, and he was all gung-ho to go up and join the RCAF, and went and got a couple of applications, and I brought the application home, and I found out that Grandpa didn't believe in war, and he was pretty uptight about the whole situation. In fact, I needed his permission, I needed his signature to finish the application and send it on up to Canada to the RCAF Training Command. Well, Dad made it very clear that he didn't believe in war. He stayed, when he came over to this country, he came from here, from Sweden, and he had been here a few years before World War I started. And when that started, he got deferred, on the basis that he had bad hearing, which Grandpa didn't have. Grandpa was very much of a pacifist. He belonged to the temperance movements earlier in his life, and he didn't believe in smoking or drinking. He believed in a lot of hard work, but he made it very clear that he despised the English after World War I, the way they treated them when they came across as immigrants, and that the English people hadn't paid up the debt that they owed the United States for all of the supplies that we had given them during World War I. So he made it very clear that under no circumstances in any way would I ever be fighting under an English flag. So that cut that long conversation up pretty quick, and he ripped up the application, and that was the end of any ideas or dreams I had of getting off to the RCAF. Raleigh, meanwhile, was taking the whole situation as a matter of course, and he wasn't really excited about going in the service. We both loved airplanes a great deal, and he did get down to the Air Corps and put in his application to be a gunner on a bomber, and for some reason the application wasn't processed, and he never heard any more about it. And a few weeks later, it was announced that the Navy was going to start something brand new called the Navy Construction Battalions, which had the nickname of Seabees. And normally in the service, if you're a truck driver, they'll put you in charge of a typewriter. It had always been that way. And this situation was different in that they would request on your application what your qualifications and what part of the construction industry you were in and what you did, et cetera, et cetera. And it went on to show later that the Navy CB battalions did a tremendous job of building airstrips, bivouac areas. They did them faster and had more expertise than any other unit in the service, including the Army Engineers. And so many times they were up against a project, and they had completed it and did it better than the Army Engineers did, so they had really developed a real great name for themselves. So Raleigh had applied for that and was awaiting call, and the folks were still upset that he didn't wait for the draft, and Raleigh's point was that he'd be better off in the CB battalion doing what he liked to do, rather than just crunching gravel and being an ordinary Army grunt. So all the time I'm chafing at the bit because I have to wait for him to go before I can even get started. And in my little trips around to these recruiting depots, I found out that in the Navy V5 program, which was your Annapolis of the Air as it was advertised, you had to have a minimum of 2 years of college to qualify. So this really buried my thoughts there for a short time, and then I got together with a good friend of mine, Donnie Freeman, who we went to school together, and we decided that if I could get boned up on calculus and trigonometry, and so Donnie sat down with me for about 4 weeks, 3-4 hours a night, and he was going to school over at the U at the present time, and so I asked him if he could get me a copy of his transcripts and his school records and all the information that was needed. And so he had some copies made of who his professors were and what classes he attended and what his grades were in those classes. And I copied this all down in another application and had a girlfriend of mine type it all up and make it look just exactly like Donnie Freeman. So instead of signing his name, I signed my name to it. And I knew that this was going to be required of me when I go out to make my application. So the day that I walked out to the Naval Air Station in Minneapolis is where they had this. I went in to see this officer, and he welcomed me and had me sit down, and he looked at my transcripts, the ones which I had copied off of Donnie's, and he said, "Well, everything looks in order here, young man. It looks like you can qualify for our written and physical tests, which will be quite comprehensive." And he went on to explain how this is probably the toughest, tightest program there is, and that I have anything that I knew of that was physically wrong with me. And I said, "No, sir." And so he arranged for a date with me, gave me a form that advised me of what time and what date I should be out to take my physical test, and another date for my written examination. And he had 2 piles of forms on his desk, which turned out to be other transcripts which he had received. And it was his job to call the university and find out if everything had everything that I had written down, which was nothing more than a copy from Donnie's, if everything on there was legitimate and honest. And he had one pile on the left-hand side of his desk and one pile on the right. And he said, well, young man, he says, I'll be checking out the validity of your transcripts, and then we'll, which I'm sure everything will be in order, and then we'll take you out of that pile and put you into this pile, and you'll be all set. And about that time, an enlisted man came through the back door behind the officer and was asking him some questions, so the officer turned around. So I moved my transcript from the in pile to the completed pile just that quickly, and the officer turned around and he said, well, okay, young man, I guess we have everything in order, and we're sure looking forward to having you join the Navy V5 program. And so with that, I went suiting out of there, and I was just hoping I could get away with that. And when the time came to take my physical, we went out, and there were about 30, 40 other men out there waiting to do the same thing. And so they had us all grouped off, and we would start through, and they'd give you the various physicals, what we called a Form 1 physical, and they started at your head and went all the way down to your toes, and everything had to be within the parameters for their eyes had to be like, I believe they were taking 15-20. They had originally had 20-20, but they had tightened it up to 15-20, whatever that reason for that was. And in short order, it meant that you had to look behind the pencil that he held out in front of you, and depth perception had to be right on the button. There can't be any deviations of any kind. I was going through just fine, and we came to the equilibrium test, where they have a chair in the middle of the room, and you have a great big bar sticking up from that, and the doctor takes and swings you around about 15 or 20 times and sees if you can stand up or if you can walk across the room. And he swung me around, and I went over the first time. I fell flat on my face. There's an enlisted man standing over on the wall about 25 feet away, and he's laughing. So I asked the doctor if I could try it once more, and he said, sure, that's okay, young man, get up and try it again. So I get up and I try it again. I fall flat on my face, and the third time I'm begging the guy to let me do it. And he swings me around the third time, and I fall flat on my face again, about 5 feet short of this wall where the enlisted man is standing. And so I'm saying, I'm sorry, sir. And he says, well, he says, nothing to be sorry for, young man. He said, we have a white line on the floor that you passed over, and that's all that's required. He said, if you would have reached the end of the room over there by that enlisted man standing there, he says, then you would have been washed out, because then you would have and then he named some long, detailed medical explanation of what would have been wrong with me. So, God, I was sweating buckets here. I was trying 3 times as hard as I could to get myself washed out, and I didn't know it. And so the doc laughed, and the enlisted man was hooting and hollering about that. I came to the teeth. They were checking everything there, and I got rejected. There was one tooth that wasn't right, and they didn't like it, and I was being rejected. And God, I just broke up. I got in the car, and I was just screaming and madder than heck, and I drove home and came home and slammed the door, and Grandma couldn't figure out what in the world was the matter with me. And I said, oh, I said, that GD dentist down there, gal darn it, all because of him I got washed out, and I can't make it. I'll never get in, and it's all his fault, and why didn't I have better teeth, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm going on, and so Mother, meanwhile, called up the dentist and arranged an immediate appointment with me, and I went down there. The doctor found out that there was a loose filling that he could take care of right away, which he did. The teeth requirement was similar to what the German SS troops wanted. They only allowed you just so many fillings, and that's all. I don't know if it was 4 or 5, whatever it was, and you could not go to, you could not exceed that under any circumstance. So anyway, the dentist writes up this long, detailed letter explaining to the officer in charge, just exactly what the history of the tooth was, and everything is fine now, and there's nothing wrong with that. It was caused simply by having a simple case of decalcification, and on and on and on, which was caused by braces in my earlier years. And so I take this letter and I jump in the car the next day and I go tearing out there, and I got to wait about a half an hour to see the dentist because now there's another group that's been going through. And the washout rate here on the physical was running about 1 out of 5 was getting turned down.